authors, and welcome to the Writer's Haven. I am your host, Helena, and I'm stoked about having one of my dearest friends in the Haven. Filmmaker Brian Bullock has written, produced, and directed a number of short and feature-length documentary films, including Bringing Home the Bacon, The Roland McDaniel Story, Witness to Innocence, and Wave, a true story in hip-hop. His documentary, Richmond 34, chronicled the plight of 34 students from Virginia Union University who in 1960 set a precedent for nonviolent demonstrations early in the civil rights movement. His latest documentary, Escape to the Great Dismal Swamp, is a rarely known tale about a swampy trail used as a place of refuge for slaves seeking freedom from the South. Both are gripping and historic tales that have found their way into our living rooms due to the efforts of filmmakers like Brian. Give it up for my dear friend and fellow American University alum, Brian Bullock. Hey, B.
Hey, B, how are you?
Welcome to the Writers Haven.
Thank you.
So, B, let's go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
When did you first become interested in filmmaking?
So I started out in the business actually as an agent, as a SAG-AFTRA agent representing actors for film and television. So I worked a lot with producers and casting directors and scripts and just ideas. I did that for like 9 years, and during that time, the producer bug sort of hit me. You know, I'm providing talent to filmmakers and to producers and directors so they can tell their stories, but I also had stories. So my interest really was more in the documentary realm. I have a background in social services, so you know I was interested in telling stories, you know that dealt with you know prescription drugs and affordable health care, death penalty, anything that involved the sort of the human condition and making just this a better place. It sounds sort of pie in the sky, but that's really what it was. And so then I went to AU where we met, and you know, and the rest is history, as they say.
Okay, so your first interaction with formal filmmaking training was at AU.
Yeah.
And did you, before that time or during that time, determine the types of films that you were going to produce? I know you were kind of doing the healthcare thing, but
right.
Did that expand to, I mean, obviously it did.
Yes.
So at what point did you make that transition?
Yeah, it definitely was. It was. You know, sometimes I say I'm a filmmaker, but really, film is just sort of my way of spreading whatever message or whatever it is that I'm working on. It's just you know, it's my tool, you know, to get things out. So it was really more about telling those stories in those areas. And film just happened to be, you know, the way to do it. You know, I could have very easily done it another way, but film I felt was really the way to for a broader audience. And you know, film is huge.
So generally, what's your process in approaching your projects?
You know what? I start with things that I care about. I mean, it's really just that simple. The things that I care about, that I really care deeply about, because you know, when you sort of take in my opinion, for me, to take sort of a commercial approach to it really doesn't. It doesn't work for me. It's really because then you don't really pour yourself into it. So let's take, for instance, the death penalty short documentary that I did, Witness to Innocence. You know, the death penalty, and I'm against the death penalty, and you know, so that, you know, it made my process, and it kept me interested. It just, you know, it wasn't anything. It wasn't really outside looking in. It was really, I was involved with it. So it's a film I decided.
It was a personal. Did you have a personal?
It's exactly. That's exactly right. It's more of a personal thing for me to be able to tell those stories and put those sort of what I care about out into the universe. Witness to Innocence. It followed 3 people who were wrongly convicted and were on death row, and luckily, you know, evidence came along and they were freed. But it's, you know, really, really compelling and interesting stories.
So your attachment to the story came from your not being okay with the death penalty.
That's right.
And so you did research to find out more about it, and then these three people came along. Like, how did that whole process evolve?
Yeah, so I actually met a professor at AU, Gemma Puglisi, who does a lot of work in the anti-death penalty movement. She introduced me to a gentleman by the name of Shuja Graham, who was on death row in California in the late 60s. He was accused of killing a prison guard and sent to death row. He was ultimately found innocent and was off death row. But we became friends, and
you and the prisoner, you and a teacher,
me and the professor, and Shuja and myself. We became really good friends, along with his wife. And he invited me to some of the activities, some of the protests that were happening on Capitol Hill and up and down the East Coast. And so I got to meet a lot of these people who were on death row and were ultimately released, because of various, it's one of those things where, I think it's a topic that has to be discussed because it could happen to anyone. I mean, it doesn't matter your economic background, doesn't matter, who you are.
To be falsely accused.
And I have discussion all the time of why I don't believe in the death penalty, and there are some heinous crimes out there where people should obviously be have to pay for, but then there are innocent people, and if one innocent person is put to death, that's too many for me. And so that's a message that really I think I wanted to get out and really tell.
Wow. So was that before or after AU? That was during AU, sounds like.
It was just after AU.
Okay.
It was one of my first sort of films.
I don't remember getting a phone call to work on that crew, but that's we gonna save that conversation.
And that is it. Also speaks to the filmmaking process. I had after AU, I spent a lot of time trying to get on other people's productions, and we know how competitive that is and how hard it is. And so finally, I said, you know what? I'm gonna buy a camera. I'm going to buy some gear, and I'm going to shoot it myself. So it was a one-man band. I did everything from shooting it, writing it, to editing it, to everything.
Wow. That's awesome. So from there, you went to Richmond 34, which is a huge story, and right. I would assume a very big undertaking, having seen it and all of the footage that you were able to get, and then also being able to connect to the families, the actual students who were part of that that protest. So talk a bit about that experience.
So again, that's one of those areas that, we at AU, you learn that one of the things that drive what you work on is access. And the Richmond 34, VUU 34, is actually from my alma mater, my undergraduate alma mater. So I had met some of them. What attracted me to that particular project was, again, one of these stories that doesn't get told. That protest in Richmond happened just after the Greensboro sit-ins.
Right,
so it was very early in the civil rights movement, and it was the catalyst to begin the movement in the state of Virginia. Went all the way up to the Supreme Court. But that, again, was a bigger project. Involved had a big crew, involved fundraising, which is always a challenge, and it was that really was like the really first sort of larger project that I developed as an independent producer.
And so right now it's in its state as a short.
Right.
And you plan to make it into a feature-length documentary?
Absolutely. Yes.
Have you taken the short on the film festival circuit, or how have you been exhibiting it, screening it?
So it has done some of the film festivals. I've been pitching it to networks, to with the growing Netflix and the online distribution and streaming. There's a lot more opportunity. So there's a lot of different avenues now to do that. So I've it's been submitted to Amazon Studios and is still in consideration, so that's a possibility. And yeah, I mean that is, I would say, one of my long-term sort of babies that will get done.
So, in approaching these production houses, how has that experience been? With Richmond 34, and then we can also talk about the Great Escape.
So the Richmond 34, it was, again, that's an independent sort of thing. And so I have not worked with a production company. That's actually under my film company, which is a bigger kind of pull. You know, it's difficult. It's very, very difficult because the documentary market there's so many talented filmmakers out there, and the dollars are so few. PBS now, they have limited resources and funds, so they don't, they can't fund independent filmmakers. So it's almost like you're not a filmmaker. You're like a fundraiser. That's what you become to make that's what you spend most of your time on, as opposed to working with production houses where, they have more resources and typically longer histories and larger relationships, so they can get these larger projects done. They have access to deep pockets and they're established. So it's sort of two paths. As an independent freelance producer and a independent producer producing my own content.
Wave.
Yes.
How did you come to produce that film? What inspired you to do it?
So Wave sort of represents another kind of step in my career. It was independently produced. I was actually working on a number of short documentaries about hip-hop legends. I did one on Cosmo D. I did one on Chubb Rock.
Love him.
Yeah, and I wanted to include the dancers, the B-boys. So I reached out to Mr. Wave, who actually co-produced and co-directed the film with me, and we started off doing a short about him, but his story was so incredible and so amazing that we decided to do a feature-length documentary. And so we embarked on a 2.5-year process in doing this film. And again, it was one of those where it was just, we had one camera, I had a light kit in my trunk, and we traveled between Chicago, New York, and DC and shot this film. And it basically talks about his life and him growing up in New York and becoming, this kid that barely finished high school, ended up traveling the world with the New York City Breakers as a dancer, and they made a lot of money, and it just was it's one of those stories in hip hop that doesn't get told much, which is the stories that I tend to be attracted to.
Yeah, because I saw that they performed before President Reagan, and
they performed for Reagan.
They were at the Kennedy Center.
They went to and performed for the King and Queen of England, and all around the world, Denmark, just everywhere. And these kids, they were 17, 18, 19 years old, and saw the world.
Yeah, and I saw a lot of stock footage too.
Yes.
So for those dream catchers out there who are going to need to delve into finding the right kind of stock footage in order to fully produce their film, talk a little bit about that experience and what it entails.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's an important one, especially for documentary filmmakers. And my advice is always to do it right. We hear these people say that, well, you can use it for X amount of seconds, or you can do this. My advice is to always do the work to make sure that those images and the stock footage and the archival images are cleared, and that you have permission to do it. So for Wave, it was we really got lucky. We had a gentleman by the name of Michael Holman who was there from the beginning of hip hop, and he had access and knew people who had access to archival images, and so we were able to get use of that. without having to spend a lot of money. But we made sure that we took the time to do it, so that you don't have problems down the line and end up getting sued, which is not fun. So,
Right.
So it's definitely a process, and it's one that it can be really daunting, but I always make sure to do that work and make sure that we're good to go.
Yeah. That was a really good piece too. So your latest film with the Smithsonian Channel. By the way, I'm like overly proud of you. With with that film, it escaped to the Great Dismal Swamp.
Yes.
So first, for those dream catchers who are unfamiliar with the Great Dismal Swamp, just give us a little history about what that is.
Yeah. So the Great Dismal Swamp is a huge swamp that borders Virginia and North Carolina. So Suffolk, Virginia, down to North Carolina. At one point, it was about 1 million acres, and it's probably smaller, a little bit smaller now. But it's this really hot and unforgiving place where now you can't even, it's protected by the government. So it's not like you can go down there and drive on there and picnic. And it's it's where the slaves from Virginia and North Carolina, just before emancipation, they ran to the swamp. Actually, they started running to the swamp way earlier than that. But they ran to the swamp and lived. They lived in this unforgiving, hot place with bears and snakes, and as a way to not be slaves. And it's a history that has not been told. And we follow an archaeologist named Dan Sayer from AU, who did a lot of work in this area to really find out how they lived in this swamp. So he uses artifacts to basically piece together how they lived in this swamp and were able to survive, for a very, very long time.
And how did you become attached?
So I was actually in the right place at the right time for Escape to the Great Dismal Swamp. I was actually working at Storyhouse Productions, which is a production company here in D.C. They also have offices in Germany. I was working on another show, and they needed help with producing some of the recreations that you see in the film. So they asked, would I be interested? And I said, sure. So I helped with the recreations, and it was actually for the Euro version of the show. Then Smithsonian came into the picture and wanted to also air the show, but they wanted some changes. So I was able to transition from the recreations over to that side of it, and to produce the Smithsonian and the U.S. version of the Great Dismal Swamp, of the Escape to the Great Dismal Swamp. So it was right up my alley. It's like one of those historical pieces that the stories don't get told.
Right. So how involved were you with the transition of the European production house, moving that over to Storyhouse? Like how did that happen?
Yeah, so it and they're two very different markets. And Smithsonian, they have a unique brand, and so it really needed to fit that. So I was actually responsible from A to Z, from redoing the narration, writing the narration, to images, a lot of the archival images. We talked about archival images before, and Smithsonian is I learned so much on that project in working with them, literally looking at hundreds of images, so that making sure it's the right image. One of the things I love about Escape to the Great Dismal Swamp is that it doesn't focus just on slavery. We've seen the brutality, we've seen that. Yeah. It's really about the resilience and the resistance of the slaves. And so the images and all that had to reflect that. And I was lucky enough to be able to be involved with that transition to the U.S. version.
That's awesome, B.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was your role specifically in that film? I know you said that you took care of the recreations and things like that, but how does that translate? How did it translate?
My specific role? So supervising the rewrite of the narration, working with the narrator to do the narration, long hours. That the editor was actually in Berlin, so we did the edit remotely. So literally sitting down for hours, beginning at 4 a.m., and working with the editor to basically recut it and get the right cut. So I've seen that film
more than you care to. And so did the Smithsonian people have people being part of that process as well?
Absolutely. There's a wonderful executive producer there. Her name is Linda Goldman, who was very involved in, and by the way, the director of that film is Andreas Gutzeit from Storyhouse Productions, who did a wonderful job on the recreations as well as just the overall story. But yeah, so Smithsonian was very, very, very much involved in the story because, as I said, they have a brand, and that is world renowned, and so they worked very closely with us to make sure that it was in the direction and right where it needed to be. And that was in itself was just an amazing experience to be able to work with those level of producers.
Right. So with documentaries, which is primarily what you've been working on up to this point, where you have a body of images and you're putting things together. And I know with your last film, the Dismal Swamp film, that there were some, like as you said, recreations. So you actually had some actors kind of what is that called? They're not reliving. What's the word? I can't.
Recreation.
They're recreating. Some dramatization. There we go.
Yes.
They're doing some dramatization.
Yes.
And so you have a director who is, and you didn't serve as a director for that stuff.
No.
Okay,
That's
so
Andreas Gutzeit. Yep.
Okay, so so it sounds like you did. You were very, very influential in the editing and the putting together the full production. But in working with a director who is shooting dramatization that would then be part of the final product, what was that experience like?
So one of the things, to Andreas's credit, that one of the things that went into that was to do the research, working with the archaeologists to make sure that what was being shown visually was accurate. And so from the clothing to the huts that you see, all that was based on images that we saw, talking to the archaeologists. Andreas doing interviews with the archaeologists, and then coming back and say, okay, this is. There are even some scenes that were cut out because we weren't quite sure if that's how they did it in the swamp. As an example, we know on the plantations they did the jumping of the broom, but in the swamp we weren't quite sure. You could say they probably did it, but if it wasn't documented, and if you really could not prove that's how it was done, you really can't do it because things were just done differently in the swamp.
Yeah.
You're in the swamp.
You're in the swamp. You're in the swamp. Okay. So what's next?
What's next? Well, right now I'm working on finishing up a documentary in Baltimore about the changes that are happening in Baltimore, some of the what some people call revitalization.
But define that for us. What does that mean?
Well, it depends on who you talk to.
Okay.
I'll tell you what I see happening, and that's some of the neighborhoods, some of the what's known as the housing projects are being either torn down or renovated, and obviously in the community there are some very strong feelings about how you go about doing that to make sure that there's no displacement. So we're working with an organization called Change for Real through a grant through Johns Hopkins University Business School. And we are sort of documenting that process and making sure that the people in the community have a voice and can have some influence on how those changes happen in Baltimore. I'm also working on a documentary in Cleveland, Ohio, about Antioch Baptist Church, which is a church now that will be turning 125 years. So we're doing a historical documentary about that, which is a lot of fun. Which is, all of those archival images, which I love working with and love using to tell stories.
One of the producers of another show that actually goes to Asbury and pulls some elements from the history of that church for their production was on our show.
Oh, okay.
Season 2, sometime in January. Patsy Blackshear. We actually talked about Roots and Alex Haley and the project that they did, which was a story about the teachers from Bates High School, which was the first African-American high school in that area. But yes, I'll definitely connect you guys, but that would be an awesome project.
Yes, that's right up my alley. I love that stuff.
Yeah, I know. B, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you,
and Dreamcatchers, I hope you enjoyed my chat with filmmaker Brian Bullock. You can still check out the film Escape to the Great Dismal Swamp on the Smithsonian Channel, and hit Brian up on Twitter and Instagram at Bundy Films. Join me next week when award-winning author Delia Lawrence joins me in the Haven. Until then, catch fire on purpose.
Everybody has a dream. Mine was to see the ocean.